Hey everybody, Tony and I wanted to record a little disclaimer for this episode and reiterate the fact that we're not experts, just some folks talking about events we saw and how they were important to us. We also wanted to mention how this podcast was meant to start conversations, so if you have different opinions from us, please speak up and let us know why you feel differently. These two episodes are going to be quite different from how we want this show to be, and it's structured in a way for us to try out this format. So excuse us if our presentation wasn't perfect, but definitely let us know what we did well and what we didn't so we can figure out what worked and try to improve on it.
I also wanted to add in that I felt like I wasn't nearly as prepared as I would have liked to be on this topic. But I honestly feel like there's so much development every single day on this that this is the best I could have kept up, and this is still the best representation of my thoughts I have on this topic as of right now.
Yeah, and we were kind of talking earlier about how this podcast was started so that we can have these conversations that Tony and I've already had. And this episode in particular is kind of rehashing a conversation and several conversations that have gone on between Tony and I. So it was kind of awkward to record and might come through a little bit with that.
Yeah, I think it seems a little inorganic, and that's part of why it's weird. But that's why we felt like we needed to add in this disclaimer in post-editing. And why we delayed the episode's release. With all that said, hopefully you guys still enjoyed the episode. Thanks for listening.
Thanks.
Hi, thanks for tuning in to Casual Conversations with Tony and Dylan, where we turn deeper conversations into casual conversations one episode at a time. Today it's February 28th, 2017, and we're gonna talk about 45 to life. So, unlike what it sounds like, 45 actually refers to our 45th president, as in Donald Trump. And it sounds a little bleak. The title's a little bleak because, I don't know, I think at least I personally get a certain sense of bleakness from this administration for a lot of different reasons, and we're gonna try to dive in and talk about some of those reasons today. Honestly, when I came up with this idea for an episode, I realized there's too much to talk about, and any specific topic, like me and Don either have or can spend several hours talking about each and every one, but I personally don't feel like spending several months trying to update ourselves with every individual topic. So I want to give a broad overview of how the past month has us feeling like. Even me trying to generalize and shorten it down a bit, it still ended up being a two-parter. So I haven't decided if it's going to be episode 1 and 1.5 or episode 1 and 2 yet. But very general overview. The first episode is much more about what Trump has done and how that's made us feel, and how we view what went on and stuff like that, and the general ideas around what he's done, not very specific things. And the second episode is going to be much more about how we as people have responded, whether it's on the left side, the right side, Republicans, Democrats, people in the middle, how we responded and what are goods and bads that's come out of our kind of response of that. And I do want to keep in mind that it's only been a month, but it's felt like a very long month. So we're gonna jump right into it. I think the first thing that needs to be talked about what he's done and how he conducts himself is his relationship with information and truth, and how he contradicts himself very often, things along that line. And honestly, it's a problem that it's you can very easily see how I say we could spend several hours on this alone, because I can personally spend several hours just talking about the idea that we live in a post-truth world, which is sad, and I don't know what else to say about it. It's definitely sad. Especially, like, me being a very factual person, and I love statistics and facts and studies and stuff like that. That whole idea is terrifying to me. But the more I look into it, the more I realize it is a thing that's going on, and it's honestly, like, just really sad to me. I realize it's not just a US problem. Like, I often have thought about education and literacy, and out of the first world country, like, we do have it really bad here in comparison. But it's recently been, like, brought to my attention that it is kind of a worldwide problem. Once I started doing research on the idea that we live in a post-truth or post-information world, there's, like, things on British immigrations, like, they have the exact same problem we have, where they don't care about statistics. And I actually ended up reading I didn't read the entire thing. I read parts of this, like, 130-page pamphlet called How to Talk About Immigration. Yeah.
Wow.
And the first part's definitely about, like, how to talk about it, what are the facts and stuff behind it. But the very second section is called How Not to Talk About Immigration. And it digs into this idea of... Before I get into that, I'm also going to mention one other example of post-truth world, which is Sweden's crime rates. Have you, like, heard about that at all, or...?
No.
So basically, how it got put into the conversation is Trump tried to justify his immigration ban based off of some random thing he tweeted about, well, just look at Sweden. Per population, they take in the most Muslim immigrants, and their crime rates have skyrocketed the last few years. Just the other day, there was an incident, something along those lines, on his Twitter. Almost immediately, representative in Sweden was like, what incident that happened yesterday? Nothing happened yesterday. And Trump basically, oh no, like, he gets caught lying, and I feel like he's just not reprimanded for it at all. Whenever someone calls him out on it, he's either, like, fake news or, like, I don't know, like, what happened to the Bowling Hills?
Oh, the Bowling Green massacre or whatever?
Yeah, like, it's like that. He gets called out, and then they're just like, okay. I don't get how that's justifiable. But yeah, so the Sweden thing is basically he said there's a rise in crime rate, and then people try to investigate to find what he means, and then, like, Sweden's, like, started talking about the problem that they have of, like, there isn't a rise in crime rate. Statistically speaking, crime rates has not risen by population since they've taken in more Muslim immigrants. It's stayed the same, but people who are anti-immigration there just started this whole thing about rising crime rates, and now people believe it. This is quickly turning into a post-truth podcast.
Yeah.
But to drag it back to the How to Talk About Immigration pamphlet that I was reading, the very second section was about how not to talk about immigration. Specifically in it, they said that you don't want to use quantitative stuff anymore. They realized through different media attempts to talk about immigration and stuff like that, and, like, through many case studies and stuff, they realized that if you want to change people's idea on immigration, nowadays you can't use statistics and be like, hey, this is how immigration's good for the economy. This is all crime rates before and after this immigration policy. You can see that it doesn't change. You can't use numbers anymore. Like, that doesn't resonate with people. Much rather, what you have to use is qualitative descriptions. And talk a lot more about personal stories of people whose lives have been touched by immigrants and stuff like that. Which on one sense is like, it's sweet, but on the other side of the coin, like, I really dislike that. And they talk about why too in the pamphlet. Apparently, what they found was qualitative evidence makes people believe that numbers are really easy to manipulate, which in some senses, yes, they are. But it's like, at the end of the day, unless you do your own personal studies and you kind of make a very good study yourself, you can't trust anyone to tell you the truth anyways. And qualitative stories, I get that, like, it's nice to feel emotional connection and whatnot, but in reality, like, qualitative stories are just as easy to be lied about. I mean, we have an entire genre of books called fiction.
Yeah.
And much of them have emotional attachments to it. But yeah, they say that people believe that numbers are easy to manipulate, and it makes them feel like there's a feeling of elitism, like I know something that you don't if you use numbers.
Yeah, definitely. Well, on that note, I actually recently, I think just on the internet, one of my friends was talking about how she has a degree, and she was in this conversation with somebody, and her degree pertains to like human services, and so she's really well studied in ideas like institutional racism and that kind of thing. And this person that she was talking to got really offended and was saying that she was like waving her degree around in their face and kind of taking this moral high ground because of her studies, which I can understand why people would feel that way about like a degree or even qualitative information, just because there is kind of a level of pretentiousness to it. Like, oh, I did my research, I looked into it, here are the numbers, and not a lot of people respond well to that.
Yeah. And I guess, at least to me, like, it's really weird because I don't understand why. Like, I mean, for me, like, I am a pretty skeptical person. I did actually, before this, I pulled up several statistics I want to talk about, but then, like, I read the pamphlet and I'm like, well, if I want to start a conversation, I really shouldn't be bringing in numbers and stuff like that. But, yeah, so I, like, ended up not including them. Like, when I look at numbers and I find charts, I am a very skeptical person. So I definitely just look at the source as well. I look at if it's a reputable polling company that did it. And then I look for how big was the sample size, how many people was polled, how many different ways that they use to find people to poll. So there's not eccentric bias, like, there's bias just between if you're doing phone pollings and an internet poll. Like, the bias is immensely different between those. With all of that in mind, how do you think that these notions of living in, like, a post-fact or post-truth world, how should we conversate with someone that has different views from us when we can't use quantitative information because we sound elitist, and using qualitative information just, I don't know, I just don't feel good about that. Like, how do you feel we should dictate this idea of conversating with someone?
Yeah, that's such a big question.
Honestly, it's like a question we have as like a society. Is there's definitely like a pro-fact side, which is about facts and numbers, and then they wouldn't admit it, like, people don't admit it, and people don't know that they are, but they're more of like a pro-qualitative side, which really do things based upon emotions, which, that's why I'm like, I need to ask you, because I'm like so far out of that world that I don't understand it. Everything for me is like logic and numbers.
Right. Well, kind of on that note, I do want to mention that as far as kind of appealing to the rational or the emotional, I think that the left has been doing this for years, like appealing to this emotional side of people. And I think that's a conversation in itself, but this whole idea of this post-truth world, we've been building up to this for a long time by dividing people based on these emotional things. Like, most of the discussions in the political field right now are like based on some kind of emotional thing, be it immigration. On either side, it's purely emotional. I mean, there's definitely quantitative data on both sides for it. But yeah, it's something that I think is very bipartisan. I don't know about how to create conversations that don't really use the numbers. I think that we're just like so bombarded with a lot of information, and as we talked about in the first episode, it's really easy to be in these echo chambers where all the information you're gathering is in a certain area, that you start to like form those ideas, and even the quantitative data, like you said, can be fudged, and I don't know.
Yeah, like, I am definitely all for numbers and logic, but by no means do I just see a statistic and believe it, because it is really easy to fudge, especially if you see a graph. You need to be such an active reader when you read articles and news nowadays. At least, like, that's how I feel, and that in itself isn't sad. It's a good thing to be an active reader, but it's really tough that you need to be 100% active all the time, or else you fall into traps really easily.
Right.
On either sides, really. Yeah, but I guess that's like just a big problem that I find myself having, is because, like, I can look at the numbers and like look them up and tell you quantitatively the pros and cons of things, but like I also see the quantitative side too. Like, I when Trump first got elected, I initially didn't have as strong of a knee-jerk reaction. Certainly not strong enough to start a podcast.
Right.
I guess I get the idea of like feelings being very strong, and it's just my brain so used to pushing that side of me down that I no longer like care that much about it. But yeah, I remember the day right afterwards during the Women's March, and there were worldwide protests, and I don't remember the exact numbers of countries, but worldwide protests in at least one country on every single continent. And like I saw the numbers and saw the statistics, I'm like, whoa, that's really cool. That's really powerful. Like, saw the pictures, I'm like, oh, that's really cool. But it never really clicked with me until I opened my Snapchat and saw one of my friends who were overseas at the time, and he was in Paris, and he was like, hey, there's a anti-Trump Women's March protest in Paris right now. He was just walking around recording what's going on his Snapchat, and that's when it hit me. I was like, whoa, this is a thing.
Yeah, it's big.
So, I mean, I guess I get that, but I guess it's just trying to lead a conversation around those points, or moreover, if we're trying to have a deeper conversations about policies that are taking place or things that are happening, we're not always going to have a personal connection. And we can't always just drag in someone else's story that we've read.
Right.
You know what I mean? I feel like it's very hard to navigate these conversations in a post-truth world. But how long have we been recording just talking about post-truth? Oh gosh. I really wanted that segment to not be terribly long, but you know, it just happens. parentheses placeholder for music end parentheses. So we ended up having to switch location for those of you guys who are audiophiles and happen to notice the sound changes. We were recording in Dylan's basement before, and they needed to vacuum, so we vacated and moved to my house instead. So bringing the conversation back to Trump, we often see him contradicting himself, such as when he says, like, there's no leaks, and all of these leaks, whether it's about Russia or things that goes on in his personal life in the White House or anything along those lines, he always starts with saying, oh, there's no such leaks, that's all fake. And then he immediately follows it up with saying any leaks from the intelligence community is extremely illegal, and I can't believe they would even do that. Just this whole war he has with information, in a sense, is really problematic to me, I guess, is the term I would use, where regardless of if it's him and the intelligence community or him and the media, claiming that essentially any media that's against him is wrong, and any media that's for him is the only real media, and being like, those are the real journalists and those are the only people. Now he just started the media ban where he's banning CNN, The Hill, and like several other more liberal news sources, and he says they're not even allowed in anymore, and he's only gonna allow Fox and I'm guessing like Breitbart and stuff like that in. And how he constantly quotes stuff and then people immediately fact check him and call him out on being wrong, and he just says, well, that's just something I read, as if like that's excusable. I don't know if there are actually any legal repercussions, but how do you think we as like people that's part of the society that he's supposed to be serving, like how do you think we should handle it when we hear stuff like that? We call him out and he just shrugs it off as if it's nothing.
Yeah, it's pretty scary to me, like you mentioned. And I think just from a completely nonpartisan view, it's scary that he can pick and choose what media he wants to be right, you know? Just because that is shaping people's views of what's going on. But the other thing about it all is that, you know, you see on the left and even a little bit on the right nowadays, these major media sources calling him out and saying here's where he lied and that kind of thing. But it's kind of scary to me too, because while the media and everybody scrambles to try to prove why Trump is lying, he's on to the next thing and his administration's on to the next thing. So this idea of even focusing so much on, you know, him saying fake news and things like that almost plays into what he wants, I guess.
It's definitely really weird, and it leads into a conversation that we'll end up having later, more along the lines of the second episode, of how a little preview for the second part of this 2-episode long series is how both sides seems kind of fractured. And just recently, like you said, you haven't really had time to keep up with current news and stuff like that. So I don't know if you heard, but recently ex-President Bush just spoke about how Trump's battle against the press is bad for freedom, and really makes us hypocrites against places like Russia, where we ask them for free press and tell them how important it is, and talk about how like they have propaganda and censorship. And meanwhile, it seems like we're taking steps towards that direction. I mean, honestly, it's hard to predict, especially by like random people like us, but how far do you think this will go? Trump's whole battle with media. Do you think like will ever get to a point where he'll just try to shut out all those outlets? Like, do you think he'll actually sit there and attempt to, like, shut them down, is what I'm saying?
I think months ago, I wouldn't have even thought that he would do something like have the media banned. So at this point, I think anything goes, and I really think that it's a possibility.
I guess a big part of this podcast is us talk about how this administration, how this month has been really scary.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a big part of that fear is just that, yeah, like we don't know where it's gonna go because this last month has been crazy. Like,
Yeah.
he's pushed his powers beyond where presidents should be. He's gotten called back out. He's applied bans. It's gotten repealed. He's already drafting up a second copy. It's just a ton of stuff that we never expected to happen in America happening in America.
Well, and, in addition to the fake news stuff that he always spouts, he's essentially fired people for disagreeing with him or won't let them be part of meetings, that kind of thing, that work with him. And that also is so concerning.
It's still censorship.
Yeah.
And it's like kind of scary because it feels like the first step to something more. Regardless of if you talk about places, countries, either current or in the past, which have had a very strong problem with censorship, regardless of if it's Russia currently or China currently, like that's how it starts, is people lose their jobs. Like the most like democratic way is people get told not to speak, which starts with Trump yelling it over people at his press conferences and stuff like that. And the next step is people losing their jobs over it, and then the next step is people suddenly go missing, and then
Yeah.
and I don't know. I feel like regardless of if it's just us or other people, like we are a leading nation,
Yeah.
and we're supposed to be the ones calling out other countries for doing stuff like that when they are. And for us to be on the path to do such similar things just doesn't sit very well with me, I guess. Yeah, so I guess like his whole conflict with truth and the whole idea of whether it's qualitative or quantitative descriptions that's like pushing influence, that's a huge part of how he was able to run and how he was able to get elected. Which leads into his choices of people in power now, which is my second topic, I guess, and like things that are a cause for concern. I just have some really basic notes of like head of EPA doesn't believe in climate change, and the head of education's funded by charter school. And just his cabinet members are insane. With other things he's doing, honestly, it seems like he talks so much about draining the swamp, but in reality, he's kind of putting in people in power who can really take advantage of their position. I know a lot more about Davos than I ever wanted to.
Yeah.
And did you ever see the thing that John Oliver did on charter schools? That episode?
I didn't, no.
So John Oliver did a really in-depth look at charter school. I'll end up adding that in the description of this. Like, starting with this episode, I'll add some show notes and relevant links and stuff like that in the description for you guys. But John Oliver did a really long piece on charter school, because in reality, like, do you know much about them at all?
Not much, no.
Yeah, and that's like kind of the reality of it. It's like no one really knows about charter school, and I'm not gonna do a 20-minute segment to cover everything John Oliver covered, because his piece is amazing, and I'm nowhere near that. But to sum it up, it's basically privatized schooling. It's schools that's owned privately but funded by the government. Charter schools, while in practice can be a good thing, and there are successful charter schools, there are a lot of charter schools that are not. There are charter schools which lie about the amount of students they have so they could get a bigger government grant, and in reality, they just keep telling the students, like, to go on vacation, basically. And that's actually just very common within charter schools. Charter schools as an idea isn't a problem, but it's them systematically are a problem. And because we don't regulate them very tightly, it's a very easy way for people to pull a lot of money from the government while making it seem like they're doing something when in reality they're not doing anything for anyone.
Right.
Is the problem with charter schools. And that's why, like, when DeVos's name popped up, like, I was like, how... Like, you can see where the conflict is in that her family has traditionally pulled money out of the government for charter schools, and regardless of if they're successful or not, she doesn't have experience in running schools, but now she's the head of all education, and she wants to pull funding from public schools and put it more into charter schools. And one of the terrifying things about charter schools that John Oliver mentions is that charter schools are supported bipartisanly. Because of how it's supposed to work, it really makes rich people want to fund it and back it. So both Democrats and Republicans are pro-charter school, while charter schools aren't a good thing.
Right.
And having someone like that in the cabinet is just concerning, to say the least. She's certainly not the scariest person in power that Trump's put in power. Personally, to me, it's still Bannon's rise to power that's the scariest. I mean, Trump's been in office for only about a month at this point. But Bannon's already earned his cover on Time magazine, titled as The Great Manipulator. I know of Breitbart and of the alt-right movement, even though a lot of people don't like being called that. But, well, I guess to start off, how would you define alt-right? Because I know it's a term that a lot of people don't like, regardless of which side they're on, even people labeled as that or people labeling it as that. But the fact that the term exists, like, means that there's meaning to it, regardless of, like, meaning behind why we have that term or whatever.
Yeah.
So how would you define alt-right to start with?
Well, I mean, I mostly just think of them as nationalists and as essentially just neo-Nazis. I mean, I think alt-right gives it a nice name, which, as that video that I showed you earlier of the former white supremacist kind of talked about, like, there's been a huge effort.
It's a rebranding effort.
Yeah, and of really making white supremacy and nationalism
Casual.
Yeah, and very...
It's the lowercase KKK.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so to me, it's a pretty word for nationalist.
Okay. Yeah, I do agree with a lot of that. It's terrifying because it's something that I've looked into since I was really young, coming from an ethnic background, and technically Northern Virginia isn't the South, but Southern Virginia is definitely the South. Southern Virginia is kind of the worst part of the South. I could probably do a whole entire podcast on how I feel about Southern Virginia, but regardless of how people believe they are, either themselves or people further down south look at Southern Virginians, to me, like that, they are Southern. But whenever I talked about white supremacy or white nationalism when I was younger, because of where I came from in Northern Virginia, I was always made to feel like the boy who cried wolf. They're like, oh yeah, you say there's activities, you say there's statistics of it, but like, where is it? Like, we don't hear about it. They're nowhere to be seen. And I'm like, I swear they're there. Like, I've actually looked this up. It's like, they're not around here, but they're out there.
Yeah.
Now it's like, I'm the boy who cried wolf, but it turns out the wolves were there the whole time, and we just never noticed. I honestly don't know what's worse, like, feeling like I'm crazy and they're all hidden, with these alt-right, or as Aziz Ansari says, lowercase KKK, which are like this casual white national, even white nationalists honestly is still a rebranding of white supremacy.
Yeah.
It's just, you try to add patriotism. They try to frame it more as, oh, it's more of a cultural thing. We have white pride instead of just everyone else sucks. And it's like, it's the same thing. You're saying the same thing. But I personally struggle with feeling like, what's worse, saying it's out there but never seeing it, or having it nowadays where we see videos of people at protests and people counter-protesting. Like, I don't know if you saw it in the video, but one very, like, figurehead figure of the white nationalist people, he runs his own news site for white nationalists, a very young and kind of charismatic-looking guy, like the video you mentioned before, which you need to send me the link for so I can post it. Like the video you mentioned before, he is like this rebranded white nationalist where he doesn't look like a crazy skinhead, like that's all tatted up. He looks like a respectable guy, and he's in these protests, he's in these anti-Trump protests, and he's recruiting for white nationalists. Mm-hmm. He's like going up to people being like, well, don't you feel like you should be able to be proud of your culture and heritage? Because I feel like we should be able to. Like, why is there Black History Month but no White History Month? Mm. And, like, he's out there actively recruiting. And we now see that. I don't know if that's worse, or the younger version of me who knew it was always there, but we never really had to deal with it.
Yeah. I mean, that's like, speaking of the Aziz Ansari thing,
yeah.
I believe in that. One of the things he mentioned about the lowercase KKK was like saying the Trump administration has allowed and normalized these folks to come to the surface and really say these things that are offensive or do things that are offensive. And he kind of says in that, like, no, you should go back to being not so overt about it, kind of.
Yeah. No, he does. He straight up says, like, we didn't realize you guys were trying so hard, but you know what? Go back into hiding, guys.
Right. And that's the one thing that I think I disagree with that is that I don't think I don't think them being open about it is the problem. Because I often think about that, and kind of in a more controversial way, with my own views, kind of going back to this election, I think this election was ridiculous because you had Trump, who is very clearly a terrible human being and a terrible politician, but personally I didn't feel that great about the other side of things, and the problems that we're seeing now would have still existed for the most part with a Hillary presidency. The problems of racism and the problems with the alt-right, all of these problems would still exist. They might just be a little more subdued. And so I often think about that, you know, what really is better? Do we want to have it as open like this? Because obviously this is causing all sorts of terrible stuff, like people defacing Jewish cemeteries, stuff like that is obviously a problem, but would that have happened anyway? It's hard to know.
Yeah, that's true. it leads on to my next question for you, which was going to be, what do you think Bannon and his connection to Breitbart and now his position in office, what do you think that means to us as a society? And I think you began to touch on it, which is like with him in the office, we're really validating, like with Trump's presidency and Bannon being in the office with him, it really validates those views, and it gives him a speaking place, especially since I think any other president, or anyone else for that matter, if called out for not being a supporter of white nationalism, but an outlet for white nationalism to express themselves, anyone else called out and those are not their views, they would come right out and say it.
Mm-hmm.
Really similar to the recent YouTube drama with certain YouTubers getting in trouble saying stuff that can be seen as anti-Semitic. Whether or not it is, it pertains no relevance to this conversation. But when they were called that, they said, I'm not. When white nationalists are like, no, you represent our community, like, we support you, you keep doing you, free speech, you're doing great. He kind of came right out and said, like, I didn't know such a huge fan base of mine were white nationalists. Unfortunately, like, I'm not a political channel. I did not mean to support them in any way, and I do not endorse them in any way.
Mm-hmm.
But if they decide that they like enjoying my content, there's nothing I can do about that. Anyone else would do that, but for some reason in the Trump administration, no one has stepped out and said that yet. And much to the contrary, they've done very opposite things of that, whether they're calling out terrorism and they're pointing out every single problem with a foreign person committing an act of terrorism, but then not reporting on a single act of terrorism committed by people who happen to be white, who happen to support Trump. Most prominent one being the one in Canada, where at first they thought it was a Moroccan shooter, mm-hmm. and Trump was like, see, this is the problem, this is why we need the ban, this is why we're keeping them out, this is the problem right here, guys, look at it. And then the second it turns out that information was false, and the shooter was actually a self-proclaimed Trump supporter, instantly radio silence.
Yeah.
Or even more recently, the Kansas shooter, I want to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just, I don't see a reason why anyone from the Trump administration has not stepped out and spoken against it. Because, I mean, it's been a month, they've won. Like, even if they did finish the recount, or they did have 100% solidified truth that Russians hacked the elections, I'm pretty sure we still wouldn't put Hillary in the office. Like,
right.
Even if we got all the information in to say that, oh yeah, Hillary won the electoral votes as well, I don't think we would pull out Trump and put in Hillary. Like, I don't know what we would do, but I don't see that being the case, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And I mean, I would be scared even if they did that, because I think really the damage has been done. That these
I mean, they're outed. Like, they're not. It's just because they're like, oh wait, Trump's not our president anymore. Okay, back into our caves. Like, and that's not gonna happen.
That would give them more reason to be angry. Like, they got a little taste of their leader or whatever, and then if they were like, oh, just kidding, they would be pissed off.
Yeah, definitely. So, out of all of the, whether it's cabinet choices or just people he's put to power, what do you think is the most concerning one? Or at least one that pops into your head, like, fastest.
It's almost like looking at several piles of shit and trying to determine which one is the smelliest.
Yeah. I mean, it's not that untrue. It is swampier than ever.
Yeah.
Maybe just more overt and more well known that it's swampy now, but swampy nonetheless.
Yeah, I would say Rex Tillerson is probably the most concerning to me just because he was so involved in, what was it, Exxon?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and just as a person who obviously has a huge concern about the environment, well, that and the guy who's the head of the EPA and a total climate change denier, that's pretty, I mean, honestly, just ridiculous that even happened at all. But yeah, I think that those two folks really are concerning to me. Who do you think is pretty concerning?
Definitely the Exxon guy. And honestly, it's like out of all of his choices, my problem with it is Trump's just so big on selling himself being a good businessman and good for trade and stuff like that, that it seems like everyone he's put in power has direct conflict of interest.
Mm-hmm.
Like the guy with Exxon, like I think it's funny because of the whole bit of NZ's talking about looking back at President Bush with fondness now, when back then everybody on the left like hated him.
Yeah.
And people gave him crap about sending in his own family to help out with Hurricane Katrina because he has stakes in the housing industry. But it seems like Trump's starting off with that and he's already putting everyone in power.
Mm-hmm.
And for some reason it's like any of his mistakes, we just keep letting him shrug it off. I mean, he's personally concerning to me. Even if you remove everything else, just the whole thing recently with Ivanka Trump and the whole line at Nordstrom.
Yeah.
Like, it's like he has no... I'm a very big believer of judging people based off of who they are now and not letting people's past dictate who they are and getting a fresh look at people. That's like a very optimistic view of people, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Because even with that in mind, I'm also a very big believer that people don't change. Like, it's very hard for people to change. But it seems like Trump has no idea of history. He just likes to erase anything that he doesn't like and just pretend it doesn't exist. Like, while he was running, people asked Nordstrom to pull Ivanka's line from their business, and they said they wouldn't do it. They're like, we're not trying to make a political statement, we're not saying by her or anything, but
Right.
we're not pulling her line just because people asked us to.
Yeah.
And this leads into like several other mini conversations that I would like to have, but it would take too long. But I'm a very big believer of like supporting what you want by your money.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of those incidents where it succeeded, and people who didn't want to support Trump didn't buy stuff from Nordstrom anymore, to the point where Nordstrom's like, okay, this line's just taking up space. It's not selling at all. It's not Nordstrom's fault. Like, Nordstrom didn't change its marketing in any way. They kept it all the same, but people just refused to buy it. So why is Trump taking it out on Nordstrom, acting like it's a personal attack onto him? Especially when he says he's not connected to the business anymore. And then with Conway stepping out and saying, oh, buy her stuff, here's a free endorsement. Like, why hasn't... Yeah, she's gotten counseling. She's been counseled, was what we got. People said, like, oh, we need more than that. Like, she needs to be more than counseled. Like, we need to know what went on. She needs to be punished in some way, shape, or form for that. But the next thing is already rolled by too quickly. Like, I haven't heard anything about that anymore.
Yeah.
That's why it's concerning to me, is because he keeps doing stuff that's obviously in his own business's interest. Regardless of if he actually has ties or he's actually cut ties, it doesn't matter because you can't ever separate the Trump business from him, you know? Like, he's the one who said it himself that, oh, well, he didn't say himself, correction, Spicer said it, is that it's his name on the line. He's still going to feel connected to it even if he has no business connections.
Yeah, so they're just admitting that you can't separate the two.
Yeah, and if you can't separate the two, like, how are we going to know he's not putting policies in place to benefit himself?
Yeah.
Which I believe in much of the contrary than that he would actually go through with that. It just seems like that's like his cabinet all around, with DeVos and privatizing schools is where her family comes from and how her family made their money, and Exxon guy, and so it's just so much more clear of how swampy it has been. I don't know, do you have much more to say about the cabinet members? Because I'm kind of drained on that topic. Or people in power. I mean, one good pick he picked was apparently for the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I mean, that guy seems okay.
Yeah, but Trump himself's like raging wars against Supreme Court as well.
Yeah.
He's fighting all the different sectors by himself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and that, as a lot of this I'm sure will come back to, just is so dystopian to me that anything that differs from his opinion, even people that he put in power, are wrong and he thinks shouldn't be there or whatever. To me, that's just like straight up like out of 1984, you know? It's, and also even going back to the idea of the alt-right, I watched this cool video which I need to find, but it was about the term Orwellian and when we use that term, and the video was talking about, you know, Orwellian being in reference to George Orwell in 1984. And this video was talking about how we need to be careful about when we use that word, because the whole idea of Orwellian is, in 1984, the oppressive government used language and altered language to kind of change people's idea of certain things. And that's what things like alt-right and fake news and stuff, and using these words, or like these buzzwords, really does. It just I don't know, it's just really concerning.
Yeah, I think it ties into our last section for this podcast pretty well, which ties into Trump's ties to Russia and how that's kind of terrifying. Like, let's talk about that for a minute. I think I can understand why people can get behind Trump's whole mentality of, oh, being friends with Russia is a good thing. Like, we're two strong world powers. Like, we've been against each other for too long. Like, it's a good thing. But I think it's one of those things where, like, when you repeat it too much, it gets kind of scary and being like, do you actually mean that? It's almost like a product placement at this point, is what it feels like. So, just very broadly speaking, what do you think about Trump's ties to Russia, regardless of if it's his security officer, the head of security who recently had to be essentially fired because apparently he lied to the vice president and may or may not have been compromised, and just like all his rhetoric with how he talks about a dystopian America that we live in, that we need to make it great again, and how that really ties in with. Did I ever send you that video talking about that? How it's really similar in the sense of how Russia talks about us.
Well, I think I saw, was it John Oliver I think he did a
Yeah, it was
bit about
his
that.
piece on Russia.
Yeah,
that
yeah,
was about
I've seen that. Yeah.
To tie in the piece, John Oliver talks about how Russia very calmly, as part of the propaganda technique, is saying, oh, it's not that bad here. America has it pretty bad too. And he'll point out specific things either about the media or about military. And Trump kind of parallel those really hard in interviews, such as the time when he said, like, oh, why do you think Russia's so bad? And the interviewer was like, well, Putin's a killer. Like, and he's like, well, we have a lot of killers in our country. And he very much validates Russia's propaganda by himself.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do you view it? Like, because I personally just think that it's very eerie and kind of scary every time he brings up Russia or Russia and Trump's ties, like, comes up. But how do you see it, generally speaking?
I mean, it feels like there is something more going on with it all. Yeah, that's just pretty scary to me. I really liked that John Oliver bit because he talked about how Putin really paints this picture of every place is shit and there's nothing better. Like, we can't strive for anything better, which is, I think, one of the differences between Putin and Trump and how they portray things, because Trump is very much painting this picture of
Make America great again.
right, this picture of utopia and that. But I don't know if his idea is necessarily that things will be. I don't know. It's hard to say, really. It kind of seems more utopian to me, but
It seems like two sides of the same coin.
yeah,
One's just looking more towards the future, and one's just looking more towards current.
yeah,
Like, whereas Putin's more like, everything sucks everywhere. It's dystopian everywhere, so be okay with it here.
yeah,
Whereas Trump's like, things suck here. Make America great again.
yeah.
And
He kind of idealizes Russia a little bit too, so maybe he's kind of pointing to them like, oh, that's the ideal or something, and in a way, I don't know.
in a way. But I guess the main meat of the segment is mostly about how, I don't remember when, I think it was a few weeks ago when you sent me that TED Ed video of Hitler's rise to power.
Yeah.
And it starts off very, the whole video does not mention Trump at all, but just the timing of it seems very clear to me, at least, that it's trying to point some parallels. But it starts off very historic. Just as a very broad summary, it's about Hitler's rise to power. Slightly less broad than that. It talks about how he takes advantage of the depression in Germany post World War I era, and he kind of rallies around this honestly minority group of people who were the Nazi Party, and he promises to make Germany great again, and he ends up getting the position of chancellor because of his popularity with the people of Germany at the time. And his popularity rating was like 16% at the time in favor, but that was enough to try to pull it in together. And he slowly pushes his powers here and there until he finally becomes essentially the prime minister of Germany at that time. And I forgot what the actual title is called, but We're casual people. Like, I'm not a historian. But anyways, and it's just about how he came to power and what things he used to abuse. And I just remember watching that video and it leaving a very strong mark to me with very clear parallels between him and Trump, between both of them being charismatic leaders, which came to power catering to a small dissatisfied crowd. And it actually like didn't pop up as clearly in my head until I saw the video. But the first thing that Hitler did was shut down the press and kind of call out a group of minorities, which in his case was the Jewish community. I think like both of those things are very apparent in Trump. Both of them exploit fears in either the minority group or of war with other people. In Germany's case, all of their neighboring countries. In America's case, war with ISIS. And they exploit fear to kind of use this emotional drive to push people to so many twos. To push people towards their ideals, regardless of whether or not people think it's right. I think it's the problem with it. And there's also just like tiny parallels everywhere that's kind of terrifying. Like there's this quote from Adolf Hitler, which reads, "The most brilliant propagandist technique will yield no success unless one fundamental principle is borne in mind constantly and with unflagging attention. It must confine itself to a few points and repeat them over and over. Here, as so often in this world, persistence is the first and most important requirement for success." And if you look at Trump's rhetoric, that's exactly what he does.
Yeah.
Like, as we mentioned before, he still harps on about how he beat Hillary. He's still going on about his inauguration crowd size. Like, he feels the need to be correct about everything until whoever's arguing against him just drops it. I think, like we're referring to Hitler as this, like, great guy, but I think he's just, like, this great parallel to what's going on. And he was a very charismatic leader, which rose into power. He very much knew what he was doing and was very good at doing what he did. So I think his word has very significant weight in that sense. And if you think about just that quote in itself, persistence is so important because, especially in saying the same thing over and over again, and the way Trump does it, regardless of if he's right or wrong, he'll never admit he's wrong. He just keeps pushing forward with the same idea. It like slowly drives into your head the idea that he's always gonna be right. And there's kind of nothing we can do about it. And it drives hopelessness in us, which is honestly kind of terrifying.
Well, and I think it was Jon Stewart who was on the Colbert Show, and he talked about how the Trump administration, just in this 1 month, and I think this was a couple weeks ago, so it's just in a few weeks, Trump and his whole administration has completely overwhelmed us to the point of that hopelessness. And he is kind of saying that we need to not fall victim to the overwhelming nature of the Trump administration, because honestly, like, it's hard not to sound like a super conspiracy theorist on some of this stuff, but I really do feel that is an intentional move on this administration's part to just completely overwhelm people to the point of apathy and really keep watering the seeds of the angry minority, you know?
And yeah, like we also talked about how, besides normalizing it and making people feel kind of hopeless, Yeah, going along with feeling like a conspiracy theorist, I talked about how I believe that it's something I've heard somewhere once and it's just always stuck with me. The idea that if a conspiracy comes out to be true, it's usually to hide some bigger conspiracy.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that Trump might have some bigger conspiracy hidden kind of terrifies me with how bad the ones that are out in the open are.
Well, it's like the whole idea that I mentioned earlier of after everything Trump says or Spicer says or Conway says, the media and everybody just like scrambles to fact check it and to be like, oh, this is why they're wrong, or this is the stupid thing they did this time. Meanwhile, they're on to worse things. Like, that's essentially how everything has happened so far with this administration is you had the Muslim ban, and then it was like, he's coming out with all sorts of other executive orders that...
But we've been so busy talking about the Muslim ban, we haven't really looked at any of the other ones recently.
Yeah. And that's pretty scary that we can really get overwhelmed like that with, I don't know, just with the amount of things. And really it does feel very intentional.
And I think it happens on both sides, being overwhelmed for things that they are currently working on, but as soon as we jump on that, like, they're still working on their stuff in the background, and things are still continuous. Like, he keeps harping on his voting numbers and stuff like that, and to me, like, that's, like, the scariest thing, and that's why I keep bringing it back up. Like, to me, that's the scariest thing, because one of the biggest things I believe needs to be changed in the system is our voting system. As most people would agree, especially with this most recent election, that it's very, very flawed in very significant ways. And I very much agree we need a change in that system. But the person who is going to change it has a very, very big power in how our country's going to be shaped for a very long time, seeing as how we still use the electoral college, and that was made by our founding fathers. And the problem with it is when we started voting systems, we have problems like gerrymandering and stuff like that was built in. And right now, the Republicans have control of the entire party. That's why this entire episode's honestly titled 45 to Life, because it's supposed to be a play on 45 as in he's president number 45, and the sound of 45 to life being a prison sentence. It's supposed to instill the idea that he keeps driving out this idea that the votes are flawed, we need to reform the voting system. But I'm honestly terrified of voter suppression. If him and, well, not him directly, but if his administration or the Republican Party are the ones that have that much control as they do right now, if they're the ones drafting up how the votes will be divided or just creating, either modifying our current one or creating a new one, regardless of what they do, they will try very hard to build in a bias for them. I have seen a lot of people that are confident that Trump will be president for 8 years already, and he's only been in office for a month. If he gets through voter suppression, he might be the president for the next 8 years. Maybe they'll reform it so there's no 2-term limit anymore. Maybe he'll be president for 3 terms in 12 years. Like, maybe it won't ever end. Even if it does, if voter suppression ever gets through, it'll be very hard to get any other person. At that point, it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or you're Green Party or you're any other party. It's going to be very, very hard to ever get a president that's not Republican in ever again. And if we get to that point, it doesn't matter if Trump is president or not anymore. Our society as Americans have already been determined and our fate has already been sealed. Yeah, to me, it's just sealed. And I don't know. I think it's a little grim in the way I look at it, but I don't think that's out of any other conspiracy theory or out of any other craziness that's gone on lately, that's that far out of reality.
Yeah. And I mean, in addition to that, I've thought a lot recently about how, say Trump is president only for 4 years, or even 8 years, and none of that happens. Whoever comes next
can be anyone. It doesn't matter. Well, no matter how bad they are, as long as they're not publicly, as people would say, a clown or a moron or anything else, we're going to be okay with it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's also scary to me, just that people will get to this point, hopefully not, but the potential that people will get to this point where they won't question anybody. And I mean, even on the left, like, I think the left already has that tendency to think
blindly
that they're
praise people.
Yeah,
yes.
They think that they're on the right side of history, and that, oh, well, this president's a Democrat, so it's all okay, but like the problems are still there. And I'm worried that whatever happens after Trump's term, I hope people won't get to that point of, oh, it's okay because it can never be as bad as Trump, or, you know, whatever it may be. Like you mentioned earlier that we're even looking back on Bush, like Bush was okay, I guess, you know? Or I've found myself looking back and thinking that way about people who were trying to run for president or something like that, where it's like, well, they were bad, but not as bad, you know?
Yeah, and we're so used to this media constantly screaming in our face, like, look what Trump did, look what Trump did, look what Trump did.
Yeah.
That once he's not here anymore, then are we gonna be as a society gonna be as proactive about finding out what goes on? Because terrible things go on all the time. Corruption is there.
Yeah.
But we've just never had it stare so brightly at us.
Yeah.
As star-studded as our good old Donald Trump is.
I mean, I can tell you that I've never seen the left care so much as they do right now, which is nice in a lot of ways, but you also think, like, why didn't you care about things before? You know, why haven't you, like, questioned anybody who's in government or any so-called authority? That's just bizarre to me. But I mean, that's one of the positives that's come from this whole thing, I suppose.
Yeah, and that rounds us off quite nicely, because that's starting to get into our next episode, which is how our response really matters, and whether or not things are a good thing or not. And as subjective as that is, do we view them as positives or not? Because, yeah, like you said, it is a good thing. Like, I've never had my friends care this much about politics ever in my life. And that's, like, a positive. But the possible negative that could come out of that would be what I was talking about before, is once Trump's out of the office, is all this fire going to die down? Because I personally think it will, and if it does, it just enables whoever to be in the office next to the next race for them to put up as crazy of people as they want, as long as they're a little bit smarter about hiding their craziness. Just a tiny bit. I mean, they could just not have a Twitter account, and then all of a sudden, like, we'd be okay and we'd be left in the dark all of a sudden. Yeah, but that's really a topic for the next episode coming up, on how we've reacted and how me and you view that the reactions could be. So, I guess what I have written down is a take-home question, which sounds like homework. But
End of chapter questions.
yeah, it's
Discussion questions.
is the discussion quiz at the end of the chapter. Please write in with a short answer. Which honestly, that's the worst part of homework, is short answer. Like, if you want an essay, like, okay, like when I was a kid, I'm like, oh, 5 paragraph makes an essay, okay. 1 sentence answer is too short to be a short answer, but you don't want an essay. I'm like, how many sentences is a short question answer? Like, what do you want out of me? Like, I would need exacts. Give me numbers. But yeah, I guess our question to you guys as the viewers are like, what do you guys think? Are our views too extremes? Are we looking too far into it? Like, do you think that we're being too negative and too dystopian about it? What are you guys' views on any of the stuff we talked about today? What do you think is the best possible scenario and worst possible scenario for the Trump administration as of what we've seen thus far? Or even if you think it's too early to tell anything. And how far do you think the parallels between Trump and fascism will really go? Yeah, there's some tough questions.
Yeah.
And yeah, we'll definitely look through all the comments, and I definitely plan on bringing in, since we've started into actual topics, I definitely want to bring in like comments that we've seen from other people and stuff like that. I mean, this is supposed to be a conversation, so I'm definitely interested in seeing how you guys think, or if you guys have any specific things to educate us on, just let us know. Like, we're definitely very receptive to feedback.
Unless it's wrong. Because that's fake news.
And I'll edit your message and then delete it and then call you out on this podcast by name.
I think what we should do is kind of like how Trump had that survey going around for a while. We should send out a survey asking people those questions, and when they don't answer the way we want them to, we'll just send out another email saying that the Democrats and the left media got a hold of our survey, so we need to redo it. So we're gonna do that, actually.
Yeah. So look for that in your wherever. I don't know how we're gonna send it to you.
RuneScape.
Look for that in your RuneScape inbox. We'll send you a lump of coal with it. But other than that, that's gonna be it for this episode. Tune in next time for part 2, the people's response. For now, you could listen to us on SoundCloud and YouTube, and reach us on Facebook and through our email account at casualconversationsthepodcast@gmail.com.